Hey moms, it's Laura Ollinger. Welcome to the Positively Healthy Mom podcast. Because there's no manual for the hardest job in the world. Hello everyone, welcome to today's episode of the Positively Healthy Mom. I'm so excited to introduce you to Mike Huber, who is a certified mental performance consultant and owner of Follow the Ball LLC. He is joining us today from the East Coast. So Mike, how's it going today?
Great, Laura. Thank you for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm really excited to dig into what it is you do and why you do it.
So I am a mental performance coach, sports psychology professional to young athletes specifically, pretty much kids anywhere from the ages of say 12 up to 22. And I focus in that age group as a father. I just found I had a lot of experiences as a parent and a volunteer coach that really sort of troubled me or like always had me very curious about how do we make the sports experience best for young people. And so about 7 years ago, I decided to upend my life. I went into a new career. I left the business world after about 20 years, went back and I got a master's degree in sports psychology. And I started my own practice coaching, young athletes and their families on how to handle the pressures of sport.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think what you're doing is awesome because, as we both know, and I think everybody feels it and they know in their bones that we're kind of driving ourselves a little crazy as parents with all the pressure that our kids are experiencing with sports and the level of competition. I think so many of us just know that inherently because of the amount of time we're spending driving our kids in the car to all their practices and private lessons and whatnot. And then also the amount of money parents are paying. And so it's just become a thing compared to, I don't know how old you are, but I grew up, 80s, kind of 90s, and this wasn't a thing. It's kind of, you did your sport and there wasn't a ton of this like kind of extra level of competition. So I'm just so curious about how do you meet a family, the child is under immense amount of pressure. Like what is the typical problem that they come to you for?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of things, but I would say the number one issue, I'd sort of categorize it in sort of the fear of failure, perfectionism bucket, where some of those things you just described, right? The amount of time and energy and money that families as a collective group put into the process, I think exacerbates the the feeling that the athlete has to be successful from a performance standpoint to justify their involvement, right? And so that leads to a fear of, oh, I played poorly today. I made a mistake. Oh, I'm not going to get picked for this travel team. I'm not going to get selected for my school team. I'm not going to play in college. And that fear of those sort of negative outcomes dictates the way they perform on the field. The irony in that is when you're thinking about those things that you can't control and do anything about, the past, the future, other people, coaches' decisions, all those things, that actually takes away from your ability to perform at your best in the present moment. So it's really my job to help them become aware of it, understand it, but then find the tools to be able to sort of work through that because it's not that easy as human beings. Like we all have our own stresses and anxiety. And when things are really important to us and they're not going as well as we'd like them to, it is really hard to stay focused on what am I doing right now? And that's what I try to help everybody I work with do.
And so you work with kind of the age group 12 to 22. And so I want to talk about how you help the kids. But as we both know, the parents is a whole very important another component to it. So how do you address that?
So I think the best thing that I do for the parents I work with, because I philosophically, I mean, yes, the kids are my primary client in that I'm engaging in formal sessions with them. I'm coaching them one-on-one, typically. But the parents, like I'm talking to them in the process, whether it's in the beginning of getting to understand and know them, or just having these like check-ins with them, like, hey, how are things going? Like giving them some tips. And I think the number one thing that parents want from me is to feel understood, right? They want to be heard. They want to feel like, whatever they're feeling and experiencing, that they're being validated in it. Because I think it can drive a lot of families crazy. And they sort of fall into that same bucket of we're doing all this stuff, but we're not getting the outcomes that we want. And it's really frustrating. It's really upsetting. And I think parents, worry like, am I doing everything I can to help my child be successful? And I can reassure them that they are, right? And I
Mm,
think that really helps them to sort of settle down and take a step back and take a deep breath and go, okay, it kind of it takes a village type of mentality of like, hey, I have Mike in this process. Mike's a parent. Mike's an expert. He's helping my child. He's helping me. And it just sort of takes some of the edge off of like, hey, let's inject some perspective and some space into the process so that we don't have to feel like we have to solve all these problems on our own because we have so many things on our plate as parents.
yeah, so true. So, how do you balance? Like, these days it's like so many kids either want to play college sports or,
Mhm.
it's a hope or dream or maybe even an expectation of the parents. And statistically speaking, I don't know what the percentage is. You probably know, like, what will actually go on to play college and then what will actually go on to play professional sports. And so, how do you balance that? Like stress and challenge and expectation, or maybe hope, like it could be a positive thing too, with just the acceptance of it's okay to be who I am. It's okay to be the best athlete that I can be. And I don't have to tie it to this future outcome that may or may not exist.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's a simple question, and it's a hard question at the same time. So what I mean by that is I think I try to help the athletes and their families understand that it's a process, right? It doesn't always go at the rate that you want it to, but if you're doing the things that young people need to do to put themselves in in the best position possible to be successful, that's all you can do, right? So it's sort of this growth mindset idea of, hey, I just want to keep getting better and I'm going to do everything I can in my control to put myself in a position to be successful. And if I don't get the outcome I want, it's not because I didn't try. Now, the challenge is we live in a society where that message is sort of typically drowned out by the outcome sort of oriented mindset, which is social media, other people, finances, all those things. And so like sometimes I find myself kind of trying to like rein people in and try to work them backwards to go, hey, let's just focus on the stuff we can control. And if you do everything you can, then you should feel good from a human level, right? From a character standpoint, that I did everything I could. And it's not a reflection of you as a person. And that's a really hard thing to balance because so much of young people's identities is tied up in sport, right? And something you said initially, I think was really rung true with me, which is when I was growing up, playing, I was an athlete in high school and I was a good athlete. Not wasn't great, but I was good. And I just think about the amount of pressure I put on myself in like the early 1990s when there was no social media. When my parents they were high school graduates, they didn't know anything about college. They didn't have the money to do all this stuff. And I was still torturing myself over sports. Now you add in these layers of like social media and the financial end of it and all this stuff. It's like putting gasoline on a fire. So I can't even imagine what I would be like today. I would be a basket case. It is really, really hard, I think, to operate in that world, especially when you're not one of the best or you view yourself as one of the best. And it can lead to a lot of challenges.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so next thing I'm curious about is for the kid who is the really high achiever, really motivated, putting all the right foods in their body, doing everything they can possibly do.
Mhm.
At what point does it become like unhealthy, an obsession, or is there no point? Is that just amazing and that's like the next Michael Phelps, like, or something like that? Like, where is the tipping line where it becomes like from a really healthy, motivated kid to unhealthy, like this kid is obsessed and they need to like chill out?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think that's one of the things where my view and philosophy has evolved over time. I think, 5 years ago, I would have said, like, that kid, right, is to me was troubling, right? It shouldn't be that way. And what I've learned is, like, listen, there are just certain individuals, certain young people who just have that hyper intense focus and motivation to be the best. And that's a wonderful thing. I think the tipping point with that is when it starts to spill into their personal life, meaning are they depressed when things don't go their way, or are they burnt out, or they don't have friends, they don't have a social life, they're not doing normal kid things, and it's affecting them visibly, right? And I think that's the line for me, is like, because like in my work, I'm not a clinically trained professional, but I am trained to recognize clinical disorders, right? So like I work with kids in a performance context, but if I see a kid is like, they have a bad performance and they don't want to get out of bed for 3 days, or they have a bad performance and they're constantly beating themselves up, that's where it starts to be like, well, you're going to burn out on this eventually if you keep doing this to yourself. And so as a professional, I have to help them find ways to sort of build in that perspective so they don't burn out, right? Can we find other areas of their identity and their person that they value, right? Are there hobbies that they could do just to take themselves away from sport? Or do they have a career path for the future that they're looking towards, that they could say, hey, if I get to that as a backup, I'd still feel pretty good? Because I think when you have that sort of singular focus and that mindset where the only thing that matters is success, it can very easily lead to burnout if the conditions aren't right in the environment for them to sort of continue to move forward in that process.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what do you do if it's the parent that's the one that's pushing them to that high level of achievement?
Truthfully, I think that's probably even a harder one to answer from me, right? Like the parents are my clients, but the young people really are the ones I'm focused on. So, I mean, certainly I try to listen to parents. I try to give them perspective. I don't, as a parent, right? I don't want anybody to tell me how to parent my child. So I try to really steer clear of that, right? Like I try to give them like nuggets, right? Or ask them good questions to let them sort of plant that seed so they can answer the questions for themselves. But what I would tell their child in that situation is like, just like a coach or just like a teacher or just like the things around you, your parents are going to do what they're going to do, right? You can't control them, or you can't control other people. So you have to find a strategy to be able to operate in that relationship with your parent. And it's hard, right? They're your parents. I love them. They love me. There's obviously a bigger relationship than just athlete to parent. It's parent to child. Like, so like the kid has to find a way, I think, to manage that, whether it's through communication strategies and finding ways to let their parents know that like what's happening is really bothering them, or like just having ways to sort of compartmentalize it and be able to make peace with it so that they don't carry that burden, that baggage, and feel like I always have to like make my parents happy, because no matter what we do, right? Like they may not be happy anyway. So like that's not a healthy, dynamic.
Yeah. And I always hope parents have enough self-awareness with this, but you never know. Sometimes you do find these ones that are living out their own dream of what they didn't do. And so they're trying to live it out back through their kids. And it's this whole thing. So, okay. Next question is, what do you do to encourage your child after a bad performance or a loss? How do you balance validating and empathizing with their sad or disappointed feelings and be encouraging at the same time?
Yeah, so I mean, I would talk about that. I'll talk about that from a parental standpoint, right? My kids are both competitive soccer players, and particularly my younger one, my daughter. My daughter is kind of ridden, not ridden. That's too strong a word. She has a bit of anxiety, right? Like, and she overthinks a lot of things, and when she has a bad game, she does tend to get really down on herself. And I try to reassure her, one, like, hey, it's just one game, right? And then let's reflect on it, right? Like, yeah, maybe it didn't go exactly the way you wanted to, but there had to have been things that you did well. Let's look at the things that you did well, and let's start to look at what can we take from what we learned and apply it to the next game. And I think that does help. At the same time, too, as a parent, like I also have to learn how to just sit with the fact that I can't make her feel better, right? Like she's going to have to go through and process her own feelings, and let her work through that herself and not try to control that experience for her, because that can actually lead to more anxiety, right? So like to reassure and say, hey, that was great. You tried hard. Maybe it didn't go the way you wanted to. Let's think about what you could do a little bit differently next time. And then you move on. But like if you're continuing to harp on that, or trying to change the way that they feel,
Mm-hmm.
that's gonna make it harder for them to sort of get through the experience Whereas you just sort of like take a step back and go like, you know what, they're going to have to figure this out. That's a really hard thing for a parent to do.
Totally. Yes. I couldn't agree more. And as a mom of 4 kids and 3 of them are teenagers and a middle schooler also, that is hard because you hate to see your child sad or disappointed or upset or they didn't get enough playing time. But the thing is that disappointment, sadness, all those emotions that comes along with that, that's a normal part of life. Like if your child never felt those feelings, then what happens when suddenly they're in their 20s and they get fired from their first job or whatever happens, they get broken up with? And that's the first time they've ever felt that because they've been protected all this time. Then they're really, kind of being set up for a big crash. Whereas if they get to experience these little micro disappointments or, macro as well, it's practice, right? And these are normal emotions. And so as parents to like feel okay and comfortable that our child is in distress. I mean, that kind of sounds like what you were saying, and I totally agree. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, of course it resonates, and I actually like the way you described it, micro versus macro, because I think that's actually the biggest challenge. Is like I see a setback in a particular performance as something that's like a really small, like pebble in the pond, because I have the perspective of almost 50 years on the earth, right? Like I see it as just one game, no big deal. For them, it could feel like everything, right? And so knowing that it feels like everything to my daughter or to one of the kids I work with, like I also don't want to downplay that. I want them to like, I don't want to like diminish that because then it's like I'm making them feel less than. At the same time, you want to be able to sort of plant the seed that, hey, like you're going to be okay with this. It's going to be okay. And so like it's just a really challenging thing. I think as humans, whether we're grown-ups or we're, teenagers or children or whatever, like we all have a struggle dealing with our own emotions at times, and unfortunately we're the only ones that can sort through it, right? And you're right, I think we're doing them a disservice if we're trying to feel those feelings or change them for our kids, as much as it might make us uncomfortable as parents.
And the best visual that I love to give, I learned this a long time ago. When your child's a little, when they're itty bitty and they get a balloon at a birthday party or something and it goes flying up in the sky, or at the grocery store, inevitably they always let go and it goes up and they're crying and they're upset and they're so disappointed. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, it's just a balloon. We can get a million others. It's no big deal. But if you imagine that is your cell phone and your wallet flying up into the sky, how upset would you be, right? You're like, and then that's how it feels to them at the time. And so I think parents need to remember how to put themselves in their child's shoes so they can feel those feelings as well.
Well, one, I'm going to steal that because I think it's a perfect analogy. And I think what you just said there is absolutely spot on. Try to put yourself in your child's shoes. Like, what would you want what would the teenage you want, right? Like even if was struggling when I was in high school, and I actually have a story about that. Like I played high school basketball and I was not very good, but I loved being on the team and I knew I wasn't very good. I just liked having a uniform and playing with my friends. And there was a time where my mother actually went up to my coach and said something about my playing time. Like she just got frustrated and I just shut her down. And I was like, Mom, like, no, you're wrong. Like, I know that I'm not that good. I'm happy with where I'm at. Like, you have to just like let it go, right? And I think for a lot of parents, they have a hard time. They have a hard time with that. But I don't want my parents fighting my battles for me. I know my kids don't, right? So like it's tricky. It's such a delicate balance that we go through.
Yeah, yeah. And that's something I'm seeing a lot of as well. So my son played freshman high school football this year and just, in conversation with lots of parents and some, this is the time when you take a step back. You don't get involved. Even the coaches at the beginning of the year say, hey, leave the coaching to us.
Yes.
We really honestly don't want to hear from you. And I think that's hard for a lot of parents because we're so used to like being advocating for our children. And that's, unfortunately, like teachers are getting a lot of the brunt of that from, an early age. And so how can we trust that our child can advocate for themselves?
Well, I think this is a really hard one in the sense that I think we can give them the advice, we can teach them the skills, but it is hard to force them to advocate for themselves, right? So like I'll just use another personal anecdote. my son plays high school soccer. He's on the varsity soccer team. He's been there for 2 years. He's had some struggles. And I think there are things that we see as parents that like, I would agree. Like, I think maybe he's being shortchanged a bit, but I am never going to pick up the phone or send an email to a coach. What we say to him is like, if this is really that painful for you, then let's talk about how you can go have a conversation with your coach. If it's not that painful and it's just an annoyance or just a frustration and you're not willing to have that conversation, then that's a consequence that you're going to have to live with. And I think that's where like we can teach them the skills about why self-advocacy is important. We can tell them what to say. We can show them how to do it. But unless they go and do it, then we have to sort of live with the fact that they're not ready, right? Whether they're developmentally not mature enough to have that conversation or they're choosing not to do it because it's not that important to them. Either way, like I can think he should do it or she should do it. But if they don't think they should do it at that age, like they're just not going to do it. And I think sometimes like in any context, whether it's, with teenage issues, whether it's drinking, parties, academics, whatever it is, right? Schoolwork is a big one, right? Like if your kid doesn't perceive the assignment or the project or whatever it is, their grades to be that important, we can push them to do it. But if they don't have that autonomy to make that choice, like they're gonna resist it, whether it's today or they're gonna rebel against it when they're in college and they have all the independence in the world. So I'm a big believer we've got to create the conditions for young people to advocate for themselves. But if they don't, like, you have to learn that there's a consequence that comes with it.
Yeah, I think that's really a great lesson. Okay, anything that I didn't ask you that you'd like to share, anything I missed or that you feel is important to share with the moms?
I think what I would say to any mom who's listening is like, I know as a father and I'm not a mother, so I don't want to be dismissive. The job of a mother is extremely hard, right? You have so many responsibilities and so many expectations that you put on yourself and that others expect of you, right? I think being able to show up for your kids, right, is really, really important, right? Take care of yourself first, put on your oxygen mask first. I'm a big believer in that, right? Like if you're in a good place and you have the ability to look at things objectively, then it's going to be a lot easier for you to show up and say and do the right things for your children. And I feel the same way about myself as a father. I think that's really important. I think sometimes we sort of dismiss or we put our own needs on the back burner because we feel like our kids should come first. And then that creates an anxiety or sometimes a resentment. And I think that's a really important thing to do.
Very valuable. I love that you said that. Okay. Well, Mike, how can people find you going forward?
Yeah. So my website is Michael V as in Victor Huber.com. So anything you'd want to find there, I have my own podcast called The Freshman Foundation. I have blogs. I have my social media. I have free resources. So pretty much anything you can contact me through the website. So anything that you'd ever want to know about me is there. And it would be great if you visited.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the time. This was an awesome conversation. I really appreciate it. And you take care.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you for listening to the Positively Healthy Mom podcast, because there's no manual for the hardest job in the world. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends.